Hello everyone, this is Alessio Scopelliti and I am a PhD student at the University of Bristol. My current research is about the growing electoral success of established radical right political parties in Western European countries. And more specifically, today I will present one of my case studies, the League. So I will briefly introduce the rationale behind this study, then in the first part I will show the academic literature I based my research, including the theoretical framework and the methodology, while in the second part I will show you some preliminary findings. I personally think that this topic is worth to be investigated, and this is essentially because in the most recent European national elections, there is a considerable trend of radical right political parties to find more space in most European national parliaments, making them a respectable and hence an option for voters. Actually, this phenomenon has already been explored in European member states of East Center Europe, mostly Hungary and Poland, which outcome of the growing electoral success of radical right political parties has initiated processes of de-democratization with the so-called illiberal democracies. So, in the last 2 decades, the academic debate proposed several approaches to explain the growing electoral success of both established and new radical right political parties. Among them, in political science, we could make a distinction between demand side and supply side. So, drawing on the economic theory, the demand side would answer to the question, is there a demand of radical right politics? And this can be measured through polls or surveys. However, when we look at these surveys, there are great differences among countries. Even if they do have the same demand, we might not have electorally successful radical right political parties. So, to solve this issue, we might investigate the external supply side, which focuses on the analysis of the institutional context, like the electoral system, or investigate the internal supply side, which focuses on the study of political party strategy or political offer. So what I will do here is to focus on the internal supply side, simply referring to it as supply side. One of dominant theories elaborated in the field of comparative sociology of politics is the classical cleavage theory, developed by Lipset and Rockham in the 60s. This theory is formed by a multi-level and multidisciplinary model which combines the analysis of West European societies and political debates, originated from the development of certain historical junctures. These elements provide a substantial contribution by explaining the formation of party systems and established party families of West European countries, and I use this model in order to explore my research phenomena. The most recent literature, moreover, on classical cleavage theory and new dimensions have repeatedly pointed to the weakening of the current West European party system founded on these four classical cleavages. And also, literature on political parties and European party competition has mostly investigated the impact of new cleavages and new radical right political parties founded on these cleavages. And from this theoretical framework, the most representative theories that I think explore this topic in contemporary European societies are the cultural backlash, the winners and losers of globalization, and the transnational cleavage. Moreover, for this research, I am applying a rational choice institutionalist approach. In this light, the ontological basis of this research is that political parties are agents able to act rationally in order to maximize their preferences or interests for political action and strategy. And when considering both the classical cleavage theory and the new cleavage theories, it is argued that political parties are programmatically inflexible towards new cleavages, especially those parties which were founded on classical cleavages. However, my research looks at how established radical right political parties founded on classical cleavages have internalized new recent fundamental socio-political changes and converted them into electoral consent. In few words, I was interested to explore the part of the model that is highlighted in red. And in this section, I investigated the programmatic flexibility of established radical right political parties to intercept and internalize new cleavage structures originated from new historical juncture. So, to sum up, the research phenomenon is the growing electoral success of established radical right political party, in this case, the League. And for this study, I identified the Maastricht Treaty as the new historical juncture that originated these new cleavages. And the research question is, does programmatic flexibility explain the electoral success of established radical right political parties? Well, to answer to this question, I analyzed the national demand space of the League and then I mostly focused on its supply side. Indeed, following Chris and his colleagues' work, this analysis looks at both the transformations in the electorate, which is the demand side, and explores in detail the kind of strategies the established radical right political parties uses to intercept more electoral support with regard to the new political potentials raised by new cleavage structures. Moreover, I conceptualize the supply side of political parties as the joint combination of both political offer and political narrative. Firstly, I do refer to the notion of political offer by considering which issues the League takes stands when it informs its supporters. And secondly, I use the notion of political narrative because of its distinctive characteristic, which informs the researcher what, in political parties' view, is important to underscore. And in order to show how the League has been able to readapt its supply side in order to take advantage of the new possibilities produced by the new cleavages, I proceeded in three main steps. I analyzed how much space the League dedicated to classical or new cleavages in its supply side, hence the level of distribution. Next, I explored the emphasis on a specific cleavage, which is the salience. And finally, I examined the coverage of specific dichotomies within the same cleavage, also named as level of polarization. By exploring these three dimensions of supply side, the following is the full list of my research hypotheses. And to verify this hypothesis, I will consider only those cleavages that measure a consistent level of coherence between the political offer and the political narrative in each dimension. And to operationalize the level of coherence, I will use the Pearson correlation coefficient, which index was already used in previous studies to compare the issues of two different agendas. And this is necessary in order to establish whether the changes towards cleavage structures that happen in one dimension of supply side are applied also to the other one. That is to say that if the twofold dimension of supply side that are strongly correlated regarding a certain cleavage structure, this informs that the cleavage is fundamental for the League, since it has been communicated to its electorate coherently from both its political offer and political narrative over the period observed. I fundamentally use two methodologies for my analysis. The analysis of demand space required secondary data analysis of time series that include variables that can be used to measure new cleavage tendencies. I hence use data from the standard versions of Eurobarometer, which is conducted twice a year, from 1973 to 2019, and the variables that allowed me to construct the longest time series to represent the new cleavage structures are the following. So the Englert value orientation index, the question if your country benefited from the European Union membership, and the question if EU membership is good or bad for the respondent. For the supply side, I analyzed the following data sources with a manual content analysis approach. Electoral manifestos of the last 10 domestic elections and official press organs of the League, from Lombardia Autonomista to the official Twitter account of the League. Now I will show you my preliminary findings, and I will start with the demand space. Figure 1.A shows that Italian society does not take stance over one dichotomy or another, but it appears to be steadily in balance between libertarian and authoritarian values. Figures 1.B and 1.C show the attitude of public opinion towards both economic and political dimensions of the European integration process. And here, the overall tendency of positive lines is to decrease, despite in the 80s the Italian electorate demonstrates to be generally in favor of the European Union. Since early 90s, the positive attitudes dramatically decrease. So, in the next slide, I explored one dichotomy for each cleavage structures across educational groups from the 80s onwards, in order to assess if these new cleavages provoke societal divisions. To achieve this goal, I used the educational level of respondents as socio-demographic variable to distinguish societal divisions in three main groups. Those who finish their studies up to 15 years old, from 16 to 19, and then 20 or older. Figures 2.A shows that since the 80s there is a societal division within Italian demand space, but it never changed. On the other hand, figures 2.B and 2.C plot a different outcome. In the 80s, societal division is almost inexistent. All three educational groups are not spaced and tend to overlap. In the 90s, the three educational groups slightly tend to separate, and eventually, since 2000s, the three educational groups dramatically space out. Looking at the supply side, the figures 3.A and 3.B show the overall distribution of topics that included classical cleavages, new cleavages, and general issues within both political manifestos and official press organs of the League. Looking first at the distribution, it appears that both the political offer and the political narrative are not independent when addressing classical and new cleavages. And as my data confirms, these two dimensions of supply side are positively correlated. And this demonstrates that both political offer and political narrative do not differ too much, and there is coherence in terms of the space given to the classical and new cleavage structures over the period observed. The cleavages go up or down in tandem, basically, and also this figure show that the League in its last national election, so in 2018, has drastically adapted its supply side in an unprecedented way by accentuating new cleavage structures when they were more salient for the Italian demand space, and then when they clearly divided Italian society in dichotomized social divisions. Figures 4.A and 4.B show that all classical cleavages were differently treated during the League's political campaigns. According to this data, the cleavages center versus periphery and employers versus worker have been very salient for the League's supply side. Nevertheless, these have been addressed differently if we consider the twofold dimensionality of the supply side. By measuring the level of correlation between the political offer and political narrative, the results show that there is a strong correlation only for the cleavage center versus periphery. Although both classical cleavages appear to be vital for the League's supply side, the correlation coefficients do demonstrate that the classical cleavage center versus periphery is not only one of the most salient among classical cleavages, but it was also coherently proposed by the League to its electorate over the last 10 national electoral campaigns. Figure 4.C and 4.D plot how the League addressed the new cleavages. According to this data, the cleavage libertarian versus authoritarian has been the most salient among the new cleavages over the last 10 national electoral campaigns, except for 2008, when it was reached by pro-common market versus welfare chauvinism. On the other hand, multi-level governance versus state governance has not been much salient among the new cleavages for most of the electoral campaigns, while in most recent elections in 2013, it has demonstrated a significant increase in level of salience in both political offer and political narrative of the League. Furthermore, the new cleavages have been slightly treated in different ways if we consider the twofold dimensions of League's supply side. Indeed, by measuring the correlation between political offer and political narrative, the cleavage libertarian versus authoritarian is strongly correlated, demonstrating that this new cleavage is currently proposed by the League in both its political offer and political narrative. On the other hand, the other two new cleavages have a moderate but still relatively considerable positive correlations. In this slide, I show the relative weight of each pole of both classical and new cleavage structures in order to explore the level of polarization. I would like to remind that my expectation is that the League does not only change the level of salience of its cleavages, but it would also be able to shift from one pole to another within the same cleavage. So tables 1.A and 1.B document the dominance of periphery and church in both political offer and political narrative, while the other dichotomies do not prevail over their antithetical pole. Most notably, there is evidence that these clashes have been addressed by the League differently in the twofold dimensions of the League supply side. Indeed, periphery is the unique classical dichotomy which has been argued consistently by the League in both political offer and political narrative. As my data confirms, when addressing the periphery issue, the two dimensions of League supply sides are strongly correlated. In table 1.C and 1.D, it is also possible to underscore how authoritarian, welfare chauvinism, and multi-level governance are usually the dominant dichotomies among new cleavages, in both political offer and political narrative. However, when measuring the correlation between political offer and political narrative by addressing new cleavages, state governance is the pole with the strongest level of correlation. And this is not completely surprising by looking at both overall salience and relative weight columns. Except for 1994, the political narrative, this dichotomy has mostly been addressed in the most recent national elections, more specifically since 2013. But also authoritarian and welfare chauvinism have strong levels of correlation. Meanwhile, the other dichotomies of new cleavages have weak level of correlations. So, to sum up, the results of the Italian demand space further corroborate that new cleavages impacted public opinion and produced societal divisions within Italian society. On the one hand, the cleavage libertarian versus authoritarian has divided Italian demand space in societal divisions since the 80s. On the other hand, the other two new cleavages produced societal divisions in Italy only since the early 2000s. And when analyzing the League supply side, this party reduced the level of space dedicated to the classical cleavages and increased the space dedicated to the new cleavages in terms of distribution, confirming the first research hypothesis. When looking at the level of salience, the classical cleavage center versus periphery significantly decreased, while all new cleavages increased, confirming the second research hypothesis. And finally, when analyzing the level of polarization, the League remains frozen to the dichotomy periphery over the period observed, rejecting the third research hypothesis. Instead, the dichotomies belonging to the new cleavages demonstrated flexibility, confirming the third research hypothesis.